Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a seriously fascinating theological paper that attempts to completely reshape how we understand the entire story of human salvation. According to this source, for centuries, we might have actually been looking at the narrative through the wrong lens. Instead of viewing salvation as a rigid legal transaction happening in some modern courtroom, this paper argues we should be looking at it through the lens of ancient cosmic battlefields. It's a massive shift from a legal framework to a supernatural relational one. So let's jump right into this.
We're going to map out this paradigm shift across 6 quick sections, starting with the traditional model, then the cosmic backstory, cleansing for approach, victory over powers, believing loyalty, and finally, Eden regained.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the traditional model, and why we might be answering the wrong question.
So, the source looks at a super familiar concept in the Western Church, the idea that humanity stood guilty before God, holding this ledger of personal moral debt, and Jesus basically just paid that penalty. But the paper argues this transactional courtroom metaphor actually answers a question the ancient biblical authors just weren't asking. They didn't view the world through medieval European legal categories, you know? Instead, they had this deeply cosmic and relational worldview. We're talking a world of temples, hostile spiritual powers, and a desperate need for humanity to be cleansed just so we can safely approach the divine.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, the cosmic backstory. We are talking about a layered fall.
Get this, the ancient writers didn't just see the fall of humanity as one single private sin in a garden. The fall was actually plural and incredibly layered. Sure, it starts in Eden, where humanity falls under the dominion of death. But then it compounds in the pre-flood era, where divine beings transgress their boundaries to corrupt the earth. And finally, it all culminates at Babel. According to the paper, Babel was this decisive event where God literally disinherited the nations, handing them over to be ruled by corrupt, lesser spiritual beings, while reserving only Israel for himself.
Here's the absolute crucial point. Humanity's core problem isn't just a bad ledger of individual guilt. Humanity is actually languishing in a hostile world, held captive by rebel gods and spiritual powers of darkness. And if we're hostages to a dark spiritual regime, well, salvation can't just be a simple financial or legal transaction. It absolutely has to be a full-scale cosmic rescue mission.
That brings us right to Section 3, cleansing for approach. We're completely reframing the idea of atonement.
Today, we usually think of atonement strictly as the mechanism that pays off the penalty for our sin, right? But in ancient Israel, atonement meant a ritual cleansing or covering. Think about it like this. If you were covered in dry leaves, you literally wouldn't dare step close to a roaring bonfire. You'd be toast. Dusty, mortal humans can't just casually stroll into the presence of a perfectly holy God without being cleansed. It wasn't about balancing a legal ledger. It was this gracious provision so people could safely approach the living God.
This is captured perfectly right here. The big question in these ancient texts wasn't, how do I escape to a distant cloud when I die? It was all about access. How can I, a creature of dust, come into the presence of the living God? Salvation isn't about crossing a chasm of guilt on a bridge made of paid debt. It's about tearing down the barrier so we can physically survive entering God's presence.
Moving right along to Section 4, victory over powers, the cosmic rescue.
Now, the source raises a genuinely brilliant question here. If the cross was exclusively about paying for individual guilt through a blood sacrifice, why wouldn't Jesus die on the Day of Atonement? That was the ultimate day for blood cleansing on the Jewish calendar. But he didn't. The timing was highly deliberate. He died during Passover.
Why Passover? Well, because Passover was the festival of liberation. It was all about rescuing slaves from an oppressive empire. So by dying at Passover, Jesus is basically framing the cross as a brand new exodus, a decisive rescue mission to free people, not from a human pharaoh, but from those hostile spiritual forces that took dominion over the nations way back at Babel. So what did the cross actually accomplish in this cosmic view? Well, by willingly submitting to a completely unjust death, Jesus displayed perfect faithfulness. And by doing that, he completely nullified the accuser's legal claim of death over humanity. The powers of darkness essentially overplayed their hand. They claimed someone they had zero right to, and boom, they were publicly disarmed. The resurrection was proof that the accuser's case got thrown right out of court, officially liberating the spiritual captives.
And this framework even makes sense of some really obscure stuff. Like, there's that super weird biblical passage about Christ preaching to spirits in prison. In a traditional courtroom model, that is incredibly confusing, but in this cosmic model, makes perfect sense.
Those spirits are the pre-flood rebel gods who are locked up for corrupting the earth. Christ wasn't offering them a second chance. He was taking a literal victory lap, announcing to those defeated divine rebels that their doom was officially sealed and his reign had begun.
So how do we fit into this? That's Section 5, believing loyalty, and how we actually enter into this salvation. The paper defines saving faith not as achieving flawless moral perfection, and definitely not just nodding along to a set of intellectual facts. It defines it as believing loyalty. It's a pledge of allegiance to the true God over all those rival powers. And because God initiates this rescue entirely by grace, you can't earn your way in. Which means, thankfully, you don't secure your place through mistake-free performance.
But we really need to distinguish between stumbling and renunciation here. Stumbling is just personal moral failure. The paper argues that stumbling doesn't forfeit your salvation because, hey, your salvation was never earned by your flawless conduct in the first place. Renunciation, on the other hand, is deliberately swapping the true God for a false one. It's withdrawing that allegiance. You don't lose salvation just because your sin quota got too high. You lose it if you actively tear up the relationship and switch sides.
All right, heading into our final stretch, Section 6, Eden regained, the ultimate goal.
You see, being delivered from the powers of darkness, that is just the precondition. It's what you are saved from. But what are you saved for? You're reclaimed and cleansed so you can safely approach God, ultimately restoring a unified divine and human family. The absolute end goal is dwelling in God's presence on a renewed earth. It's the original design of Eden, not just regained, but completely surpassed.
The whole story, literally from the first garden to the final city, has been moving toward this exact point. The cross wasn't just about appeasing some offended, transactional sovereign. It was about taking back a lost, contested world so that God can welcome his family home to dwell with him once again.
As we wrap up the explainer today, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative question based on these ancient texts. When you think about the grand narrative of salvation, are you just seeking a cleared ledger in some cosmic courtroom? Or, like the ancient writers, are you hoping to be welcome home? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I really hope it sparks a whole new way of looking at these foundational ideas.